Welcome back to our channel. This is David, part of the Haworth Bears. Michael's back at the B&B because obviously this is not disabled friendly to actually go do this walk. So anyway, Adam, who lives on the street, part of the, what was it? Haworth Haunted, was it? You do know! Anyway, it's the Ghost Walk. So come along with us and we'll let you see what goes on. So before we start our ghost walk, here's a few shots of the top of the street. The actual ghost walk takes place just over there at about 8 o'clock. Currently the time is about 42, so I've got a bit of time, so I just thought have a quick view.
Well, I shall be your guide to the Garthry and your escort to the Eldritch as we peer through the portal to the phantasmagorical. And here we are, Black Bull. If you know anything about the Brontes at all, you're probably aware that there were three sisters, three works that were left behind, and they had a brother, Branwell, who aspired to be a poet and an artist, and unfortunately he died an alcoholic. His death aggravated, his condition aggravated by, when he died of tuberculosis, his condition was aggravated by his alcoholism and severe drug addiction. He was addicted to laudanum and opiate tincture. And I'm a storyteller, but I do try to get my historical facts as accurate as possible. As I said before, it's built right next to the graveyard. Now, we tend to romanticise this period of the Brontes, this Victorian era, the images that we have of, excuse me, it's intriguing when you film about the life of Emily Bronte and the woman who's playing a beautiful rain.
The birds. Why? What have you done? Have you woken up the spirits?
Yeah, their timing is exquisite, is it not?
Oh my god, I've never seen that before.
I don't know if you've had a wander through the graveyard yet, but when we get round to it, you'll see how small it is. And for most of, for most of that time, up until about the 1780s, it was half the size it currently is. So most of those bodies were squeezed into half of its current size. Which means that where you see a grave, that grave probably has about 10 bodies reused at least 10 times to fit that number of bodies into the grave. So when a body was... Back in February last year, there was a local paranormal investigation group, Keithley Paranormal Investigations, KP Nuts as they like to call themselves. They did an investigation here. I don't know if you know that, remember that programme Most Haunted?
Yep.
They did an investigation here about, was it about 10 years ago? No, a bit more than
no,
15
bit more.
years, something like that. Which if you're interested, you'll find, if you Google Most Haunted, like Google Haworth, it'll be around somewhere. But the Keithley Paranormal Investigation Group, they did an investigation here as recently as February, just before lockdown last year. And their resident psychic, a young chap called Matt, lovely bloke, he told me that when they were investigating the cellar there, he could very strongly feel the presence of the disturbed dead beneath his feet, beneath the ground below the cellar. But that water that has filtered through the ground here has had another consequence. Back during the time of the Brontes, all of the water that the people in the village here used for everything came from wells and springs. And so there were a number of springs, a couple of springs I think, available in the village itself and a few just outside, and people would go and take their water from those. The Black Bull used to brew its own beer, and at that point they brewed it from water that they got from a well that they had dug behind the pub. And they would draw the water from this well, they'd pour it into a trough behind the pub, they'd leave it in the sun, they'd pour some chalk into it to help purify it, and then they'd use it to ferment their beer. And it was only after around the 1850s when Patrick Bronte, the sister's father, had campaigned with the authorities that was organised. But the water that they drank from the wells, that was the water that fell on the moors. And you remember that I described how it filtered through the ground and eventually filtered through the graveyard. It filtered through the graveyard before it reached the springs and the wells. The biggest causes of death were tuberculosis, typhus and cholera. If you know your diseases, you'll know that cholera specifically is a waterborne disease. So people were dying of these diseases, they were dying of cholera, they were then getting buried in this graveyard. Their diseased bodies were decaying in the graveyard, and then that water was filtering through their bodies, being collected from the wells and from the springs, and then being used by the villagers who were then dying from these various diseases, being buried in the graveyard, and so to the ghost of Branwell Bronte. Branwell used to sit in this pub and entertain his friends, and he was quite popular with the local drinkers here. He apparently was able to write with both hands simultaneously, so this was a party trick. People would reminisce many years afterwards about Branwell writing, sometimes even in 2 different languages. He would write them letters. And there's a servant's bell nearby where he would sit, still there above the fireplace, obviously now no longer connected to anything that would have made it to ring. But guests who have stayed here overnight report hearing this bell ring after midnight. He had his favourite chair. It's known as Branwell's chair, not very imaginative, but there's a replica of the chair still here, and when the Keithley Paranormal Investigation Group did their investigation here back in February, Matt again tells me that around that chair he felt very strongly the presence that he believed to be that of Branwell, which he described as being one of bitterness and regret, which, when you understand that Branwell was ghost stories. So let's wander on in this direction. Yes, I know, I wasn't going to tell that one. Here we have our stops. Before I started doing ghost tours, I was thinking of going into the sale of second-hand medieval torture entities, but that was only one. Here, see the unusual groove marking around the outside. According to a local historian, that used to be a child's mortuary slab.
Oh my god, I didn't know that.
The grooves there would be for carrying the blood away when they carried out post-mortem. So I'm guessing when it stopped being a mortuary, a little bit of Yorkshire thrift there, they decided weren't going to waste it, and they weren't going to carry it any further than that. The ghost that is most famously associated with the Old White Lion is the ghost of a young woman from 1906 called Lily Cove. Has anyone heard of Lily Cove? No. I mean, famous within Haworth, put it that way. Lily was one of a balloonist and parachutist act. And the story goes that in 1906, the Haworth Gala Committee decided that they wanted to raise money for the Victorian Nurses Fund, but they needed a big attraction because they wanted to attract a big crowd. And so they booked this chap called Captain Frederick Bidmead, fantastic name, and the image that comes to mind is probably about right, sort of middle-aged, younger end of middle-aged man, military bearing, that kind of big twirly handlebar moustache, waxed ends. And he travelled the country with a young woman called Lily Cove. She was 21, and they were balloonist parachutist act. So he took care of the technical side. He was a balloon performer. He inflated this Victorian gas-filled balloon, and they would send Lily up into the sky. You're probably imagining some kind of wicker basket. It was a trapeze, so like 2 pieces of rope and a stick. So she'd be sat on this stick, and again, you know, you think these like Victorian skirts. You didn't want to go up and parachute down in one of those. So before she went up, apparently she would like rip this skirt off. So much gasping and shock and horror. Underneath she was wearing bloomers that went from waist to ankle, covered in multicoloured ribbons, but it created like massive column inches in the newspapers, and all the men loved it. So yeah, they would launch her into the sky, and then when the balloon reached the required height, she would jump and then parachute down. And this was the act. And it attracted 6,000 people to the gala. So it was phenomenal. When they got here, she was staying here in the Old White Lion in room 7 there. And when they got here, she met a young man called Charles Merrill, who was the son of a local mill owner, and so quite wealthy, and the first person in Haworth to own a motor car. So he drove her anywhere. They kind of hit it off, I think. There was a spark between them. And so he was driving her anywhere. But there was, as you can imagine, otherwise I probably wouldn't be telling you this story, a tragic accident. Come the jump, Lily was launched, but according to eyewitnesses, she jumped too soon. She jumped before the balloon had reached its required height. Then, when the parachute opened, the parachute pack appeared to leave her body. She plummeted to the ground. Now, Bigby would have been watching her through a pair of binoculars because he would take a horse and cart to go and retrieve her, the balloon and the parachute. So he went with the horse and trap to where she had landed, found a farmhand kneeling next to her in the field, who said that when he got to her, he thought she was alive. Her eyes were open, but she was completely unresponsive. The next person to arrive was Merrill in his motor car, and they summoned a doctor, who, when he got there, pronounced her dead on the spot. They loaded her into the horse and trap, brought her back here, and took her up to room 7 and laid her out on her bed. 21. An inquest was held, and they found, there are a number of variations proposed, stories, but they found in favour of accidental death. It was suggested that Bidmead had even potentially sabotaged her equipment, but he was jealous of the interest that was being shown between Merrill and Lily. But they thought that she possibly even shrugged herself out of the parachute because she realised that the parachute could have even still carried her far enough to take her into the reservoir. But she has been said to haunt that room since that day, since 1906. And the hauntings take a couple of different forms, both of which I've received stories about from people who stayed here. In 2013 there was a chap who said that he stayed here as part of a business meeting. He stayed with 4 colleagues, and he was staying here, and at 3 o'clock in the morning he was awoken by what he thought was like a cat or something jumping onto the bed. Had no idea how it could have got in there, but when he opened his eyes, there was a woman stood on the end of the bed, just looking down on him. She was like dressed in white, as if wrapped in a shroud, and surrounded by whitish hands. Obviously, he was quite shocked. He looked at her and said, "How did you get in here?" I've never seen anything like that. I've no idea what I was. He started to feel for the light switch. She didn't say anything. She didn't respond in any way, shape or form. He said, what do you want? Again, he couldn't find the light switch. She didn't respond. At which point he said, "I'm scared, please leave." And she disappeared. He found the light switch at that point, turned the light on. There was nobody in the room. The door was locked. Nobody could have got in or out. He went downstairs in the morning, told his colleagues at breakfast, and they thought this was hysterical. They thought it was really for the story. It goes with Living Cove. That actually quite often appears to people like that. There was another woman got back in touch with me. Now, bless her, she had actually done some research.
That's spooky.
I think that's the first time we've ever seen them walk around graveyard.
Wow. Adam, they're following you. What magical powers do you possess? Yeah, I never knew about that one, the white lion.
The Lily Cove one.
No, I never knew about that. And that slab on the floor.
I did not have.
Oh my god.
That slab so many times.
Just, yeah, we walked and it's just like, oh my god.
It's kind of a bit of a macabre
What's
story behind it.
But
But then,
just dead people.
yeah, but like Adam was saying, this media, films and TV shows always romanticise the Victorian era, but actually it's called the Gothic era in literature for a reason, because it's not romantic in any way, shape or form.
In 1974, it used to be known as the Toby Jug Cafe. Half of it was the left-hand half was the general store, and the owner of the Toby Jug Cafe was one Mr. Keith Ackroyd, and Mr. Ackroyd apparently requested an exorcism.
Ooh.
And the reason he'd requested the exorcism was because, well, he said that the place was haunted. He claimed that on the night of the previous December the 19th, the anniversary of Emily Bronte's death, that an apparition had appeared in his living room. He was sat in the living room, which was behind the cafe area, and he heard a noise behind him. He turned around and there was the young woman dressed in period costume, with a wicker basket on one arm, wearing a bonnet, surrounded by a bluish haze, as he said, the apparition of Emily Bronte. And she looked at him and she smiled and she giggled. And he said she made her way to where the old staircase had been. Apparently there'd been some work done and the new staircase had been put in a different location. So he ran up the new staircase in time to see her appear upstairs, go into one of the rooms, turn round, smile and giggle again, before coming back out, smiling and giggling, coming downstairs, emerging out into the street, smiling and giggling, before disappearing. And he claimed that she'd done this on the previous 8 years. And he was concerned that if word got out that the place was haunted, he was trying to sell the place, and it might put off potential buyers. Now, I don't know about you, but if I lived in Haworth and my place was haunted by the spirit of Emily Bronte, I would consider that a unique selling point. But he claimed otherwise, and he requested this exorcism, which was apparently, he found a priest willing to do it, but the priest seniors turned him down. I guess they probably regarded exorcisms as something a little bit more important than something that they would do to chase off the ghost of Emily Bronte. But on the night of December the 19th, 1974, there were a group of locals, teenagers, psychic investigators and a bunch of journalists all gathered around outside the Toby Jug Cafe, awaiting for the next appearance of the apparition of Emily Bronte, who, quite wisely on this occasion, I guess, chose not to turn up. Have a look at the top left, just have a look at the roof, at the corner of the roof.
You can see it.
Yeah.
You can pour down the wall. And it's one of 5 carved
You hold it.
heads that I'm aware of attached to buildings that aren't churches in Haworth. There's one above, I don't know if you've been to the pub at the very bottom of Main Street called the Old Hall Inn. There's one above the main entrance to that, the Old Hall Inn, and the Old Hall, it's one of the few pubs in Haworth that isn't a coaching inn. It was built as a mat house. This one puzzles me. It's very unusual in feature. I have some theories, but they really are just theories. Black Phantom Ghost Walk.
God, all the years you've lived in Haworth, we've never once been to the parsonage.
Well, we'll have to go, won't we?
Yes, we will.
We will have to go to the parsonage. Have you ever been wandering in a graveyard at night time?
Yeah, we walked through this quite a few times.
Yeah, but what time is it? Is it like 9 o'clock?
Nearly, yeah.
Wow, so we've been on this tour about an hour already.
We've learned quite a bit of history of Haworth in the process.
Yeah, would you like to go and there?
Not right now.
Go walk about in the graveyard. Well, I've walked through this graveyard during the day and it's been, but at night time it's a different kettle of fish. Weirdness. With bats flying about.
I find they, every Monday used to lay their laundry out to dry on the gravestones, which he thought was immensely disrespectful, and he used to come and like pull everything off, and they used to get into quite aggressive fights about it. But he won in the end, as he usually did. Yeah, people tell me their own stories of experiences when we come on these tours. I had one woman tell me that she was here once with her son, who was 11, only a few weeks before the tour, and they were doing family history research, genealogy research, checking out graves, when they both heard at the same time the sound of footsteps running, coming from above ground and below ground simultaneously. Now, I asked her at the time, have you heard the legend, the local legends of the tunnels that are supposed to connect the cellars of the pub at the bottom of the street, the Old Hall Inn, and the vaults of the church here? She hadn't, so I told her. Obviously, once she was aware of this like local folklore regarding the tunnels that would run underneath the graveyard here, the sound of running coming from above and below ground was just that little bit spookier. There's a story of a woman who was wandering through the graveyard and she noticed that she was being followed by a man dressed in period costume. I claim no responsibility for that one, by the way. And she turned around to admonish him, because obviously that's quite unnerving. But when she turned round, he was no longer present. But there was nobody within, there was nowhere within reach where he could have disappeared to. There's an old tradition in the north of England related to churches called watching the church. Not a very exciting name, I know, but it's a vigil. And this vigil, which would take place normally on St Mark's Eve, but it varies from location to location, would involve fasting throughout the day. And then come 11 o'clock in the evening, you would hold that vigil. It was a silent vigil in the porch or by the porch of the church. You'd hold the vigil for 2 hours, and then at the end of those 2 hours, 1 o'clock in the morning, you could expect to see a parade of apparitions, spirits, making their way into the church. But these were not spirits of the dead in the normal sense of the word, but they were spirits or apparitions of those who were to die in the year to come. So woe betide you if you saw your own visage amongst the spirits parading into the church. But not only were they apparitions of those who were to die in the year to come, but they would appear in the manner in which they were to die. So if they'd been stabbed, they would be bleeding from wherever they'd been stabbed. If they'd been run over by horse and cart, their legs would be broken and mangled and they'd drag them behind them. If they'd been hung, their necks would be broken and head hanging. And obviously there would always be one or two unscrupulous folk who would be willing to say that they had spent the night out in the churchyard and prepared to take a shilling or two from the more gullible villagers in return for the names of those that they claimed to have seen. As he screamed, he blocked the coffin and he turned round and he ran straight back out again. Obviously John had to turn and follow him, and when he calmed him down enough to find out what had to go down, one of our counsellors has put a little sign that indicates where it is. The only marking on it are the letters JS 1796. And for a long time nobody really knew who JS was. It was pointed out as being the grave of a sheep thief who had been hung. But we now know that JS stands for James Sutcliffe. And James Sutcliffe was a highwayman. So not only did, when we had these toll roads built running through Haworth, did a whole load of the pack horse carriers lose their livelihood, we had a whole new brand of criminal, the highwayman. Hurrah! James Smith was a highwayman who was reputed to spend his time sat in the Black Bull. He would slowly drink a beer or something, not getting drunk, because what he would be doing would be listening to the conversations of the travellers who had stopped overnight. They would be having a hearty meal before they rested for the night and having a few drinks, and whilst the alcohol was taking effect, loosening their tongues, they would start to tell stories, and they would probably fall to boasting, and he would be listening, deciding who he was going to follow when they left the pub the next day. On this particular occasion, he followed one Mr. Wignall en route to Keighley, and he lightened Mr. Wignall's load by 60 guineas. But unfortunately for James Sutcliffe, he was apprehended. He was taken to York, he was tried and found guilty, and he was hung. Very often, people who were hung at Tyburn in York, they would have found their way onto the surgeon's table, dissected in the name of science, or dragged through the street for the entertainment of the masses. But Mr. Sutcliffe had married. Not only had he married, he'd then run off and married again, and then run off and married again, and then returned to his first wife, who the judge described as a virtuous woman. I'm guessing since she took him back, that's probably a reasonable description. There's a trigger mist. But she had attended to him in prison, and his body was given over to her, and he was brought back here, and he was buried in consecrated ground. But local ghost lore has it that his ghost still sits in the Blackpool pub. So if you are ever having a drink, beer, coke, whatever, in the pub, and you get that sensation that somebody is watching you from behind, just be careful what you say, because it could be the spirit of James Sutcliffe listening in on your conversation and deciding whether it's you who's going to follow when you leave the pub. So those are my stories of Haunted Haworth, and I do hope that you've enjoyed them. If you have enjoyed them, please put a like on my Facebook page, share a review. If you haven't enjoyed them, I am a master hypnotist, and you can forget everything that you've heard over the last hour and a half. But I thank you very much for your company, because
Thank you very much.
I do this largely for the pleasure of it, and it's your company that makes it a pleasure. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you, that was really, really good.
And well done for bringing the birds to add the atmosphere.
They're absolutely
Theatrical.
fantastic. I don't know what I'd do without them. I'd have to invent them.
You'll have to see if you get them next time.
Yeah. They frequently attend, not always.
That was rather interesting, Megan, wasn't it?
Very interesting, yeah.
Stuff about Haworth that I have never heard of before. Very interesting. Adam, Sergeant, who took us on the tour, who you saw as part of the video. Very, very interesting.
Chat.
Lots and lots of stories. Far too many that I can actually add onto this blog.
You have to come see it for yourself.
Yes, please do. Come, enjoy, well obviously not in the horrible weather, but
But
anyway,
it's all Yorkshire weather.
had a fantastic time. Definitely
Well worth
recommend it. Well worth it. It's only £8.50. He started the tours on Thursday, which is today. Thursday, Friday, Saturday. You can go to the website online, pre-book it online, and yeah, join in, enjoy the local history and the tours and stuff that's happened in Haworth over the
Many centuries.
Yep. All right, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.